Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. We have a lot coming at you this week. This is our third show since the start of the Third Intifada, the war in Gaza and Israel and Palestine, the Holy Land in general being engulfed in the biggest war it's experienced, frankly, since the 60s, some would even say the 40s. So this is a really big deal. Obviously, it's going to be the focus of the show for a while now, in tandem, of course, with the war in Ukraine as World War III rages on, new fronts developing, it seems now, monthly and weekly. But we have some unfortunate news to come at you today coming out of the Holy Land directly. This first part of the show, we're going to talk all about church stuff, some in Ukraine, mostly in the Holy Land. Dmitry, what is the first item? How are you doing this evening as well?
Doing great, Conrad. Naturally, the biggest news of the week and probably could be even the month, the Israeli bombing of the Church of Saint Porphyrios in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. This news came around on the 19th
Hmm.
of October, and unfortunately, the solemn news coincided with the Ukrainian High Rada, which is the Ukrainian Duma parliament equivalent, their Congress, issuing a ban on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is the canonical Orthodox Church. They're affiliated with Russia naturally, obviously coming out of there, but Ukraine, the government actually instituting a ban. And this church, of course, has close to 12,000 clergymen across all of Ukraine, about 10,000 Orthodox parishes, deacons, bishops, and the Ukrainian government has just officially signed the ban, as in anybody associated with this church structure, or at least once they ratify this particular bill and it goes through parliament, which it already has been voted on. Anybody affiliated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will now be officially prosecuted, or the Ukrainian prosecution is going to work overtime. Naturally, these two events occurring literally on the same day, the 19th of October, have led to many to speculate that, in fact, it's probably the Ukrainian parliament, the High Rada, actually chose this very strategic time of tragedy and death occurring in the Middle East to use that as a distraction in order to pass this very controversial and, frankly, Diocletian type law into, essentially institute it, which even I think even liberals in Europe and America wouldn't agree with. Frankly, they're pretty obsessed of, liberty of religion and freedom to do as you will. So I think even the normies would, the people of that particular mindset would disagree with something like this. But in fact, they're quite tactical. They've used it to attack the Orthodox Church abroad at the same time as a literal Greek Orthodox Church of the Jerusalem Patriarchate was bombed in Gaza, unfortunately, by none other than the Israeli Air Force. So they dropped a bomb direct. It was a direct hit onto the church hall, which was directly attached to the ancient church of Saint Porphyrios, which houses his relics actually. But the church itself, it goes back to at least the 400s AD. So the time when Saint Theodosius II, Roman emperors, Pulcheria, Eudokia, all of the great saints, even pre-Justinian type saints of the Roman Empire, actually invested in the Holy Land. So this church is one of the original constructs in Roman Palestine, which is now being, of course, demolished. It seems bomb by bomb, you could say.
Oh, it's a real tragedy, and of course, people remember this was falsely reported, I guess, in the midst of some bombs falling near the church a week ago. So people got up in a big fuss. People were really mad. People were upset because this is the third oldest Christian church in the world that is still operational and standing. I believe second oldest Orthodox church. So a very important, monument to Christ in world Christendom. And now, of course, it seems that was just a prophetic foretelling of what was to come this week. And people are saying, well, the temple itself wasn't destroyed. Well, the temple was damaged. And in reality, what was destroyed was an area where even more wounded people, both Muslim and Christian, were being held. And so far, we've confirmed, I believe was it 12 or 16 Christians confirmed. Some of them related, actually, to Congressman Justin Amash. These are, Jerusalem Patriarch and Antiochian, Christians. And it's a true tragedy. As Archbishop Alexios and others have said, these are, the new martyrs of Gaza. He said that when he was commemorating them as a Palestinian flag hung below him and he sensed their bodies. And he was, of course, wished well by Patriarch Theophilos, who disavowed the Zionist aggression against the churches. Patriarch John X of Antioch joined him in that statement. Patriarch Kirill supported both of them in their efforts. The Archbishop of Jordan, as well, has been kind of a key mediator between all of these characters as kind of a safe third position where people can go to, and people, I think, in the West Bank even are already fleeing to Jordan, despite the fact that, Jordan does, we discussed this last episode, have a contentious relationship with, Palestinian refugees and whatnot. But it truly is a tragedy, and I think there's no coincidence To hear more about how this might be relevant, be sure to listen to this week's Ether Hour. We have a whole lot of things to talk about. It's really a fascinating episode. But October 19th is when these two horrible tragedies struck the Orthodox world, and some of the saints commemorated on this day. We have St. John of Kronstadt. He was actually born on October 19th. And we also have St. Anthony, Schema Archbishop of the Kiev Caves Lavra, which of course directly ties into the illegalization of what's going on. And then there's, of course, new martyr Nicholas Davila of Jerusalem. And, these are the fact that we know that the devil likes to work in his kind of anti-Christian, inverted ways. And so it makes sense that on these joyous feasts of which prayers are offered to saints that are so directly tied to these conflicts, saints that, are directly watching over these regions, of course, the evil one would seek to rattle these saints like that. Of course, we know that doesn't happen. They're rejoicing in the eternal life of Christ, but to us here on earth, it really is rattling, and people are starting to despair. I think, unfortunately, there's not that many Christians in Gaza. There's like 3,000 of them, and a large percentage of them were just wiped out in one fell swoop. And of course, there are still people that are trying to run interference, say, "Oh, well, they're housing Hamas." It's as Patriarch Prime made on Twitter. Despite all of these Hamas fighters hiding in churches, hiding behind Christians, the strike managed to kill no Hamas fighters. So I just don't think it's safe. I just don't think it's honest to say that Israel is, going after any and all ethno-religious enemies, mostly these Palestinians that would support Hamas. But they have no problem if a few, as they would call them, idolatrous, Christian temples were destroyed in the process. They view it as a happy accident at best, if not something that, well, we have some missiles, let's toss them that way. I don't think that's too much to say.
Yeah, that's right. We've heard so many disgusting excuses from liberals, I want to say explicitly pro-Zionist forces. Anti-Orthodox sentiment is quite broad at the moment, but the excuses they make are quite astounding. So I made a mistake. So Saint Porphyrius, of course, was from the 400s, and he was actually the bishop of the region, the bishop of Gaza, at the time. But the church itself, I heard excuses, Conrad, where they were saying, well, the church was actually heavily renovated. It doesn't go all the way to the 400s AD. It was renovated heavily and rebuilt in the 1100s and 1200s. So it's only 1,000 years old. It's not 1,600 years old. So that's okay. I'm sure that's acceptable. Even if the church was 10 years old, it would not be acceptable for the IDF to be dropping bombs on the church hall, anything adjacent to the church. In fact, the fact that they're just dropping these bombs on civilian targets to begin with, claiming that there are Hamas fighters. The ridiculous part is because Hamas is a very Sunni Islamic organization. So frankly, they're not affiliated with Christianity in any way, but that doesn't stop them from bombing, even as was revealed at least on the 17th of October, that a Baptist hospital as well. So in fact, two tragedies almost on the same day, and a lot of civilians dying and almost no Hamas fighters actually perishing. According to these strikes, it seems like Israel is raining terror on the population, trying to get them to submit, to kneel down, to heal before what should be, at least we're expecting to be, a proper ground invasion. Now, the ground invasion being delayed is probably, on one hand, providential. On the other hand, I think Israel really understands, looking at, and we'll speak about this later in the episode, the overall opinions of the world exactly on the conflict and what's being witnessed here in the Middle East. I think they're trying to gauge how much support they'll have, who will be on their side, and which potential sides will join the conflict. But naturally, this tragedy is probably the most negative event to occur to Orthodox Christians in Israel for the last, I want to say, since the State of Israel came into being. Probably the greatest tragedy since the State of Israel came into existence, I want to say, and since the 1947-48 war, when there was a lot of abuse ongoing with just Greek and Russian priests and monks being abused by IDF, as well as other communist-related forces in the Holy Land, which we speak about in the latest A4Hour episode pretty in depth. So yeah, definitely a pretty tragic week. A lot of really dark news. But again, I agree with Archbishop Alexios and some of the other bishops who have spoken out in support. There is a high likelihood that these particular Christians who perished from these bombings, they should be considered for at least as passion bearers. If not confessors of the faith, those who died. And in fact, the Greeks may even canonize them in a few years' time as new martyrs, simply because they have died. They've lived under, you could say, a Zionist occupation, surrounded by people not of their faith, essentially Sunni Muslims. They lived alongside them. They probably, They probably treated their neighbors very well. In fact, the relationship,
Well, let's
Conrad.
think about the situation that they were in. I mean, right? Those people, in theory, people like, oh, evacuate, evacuate. It's like, look, well, in theory, if you're supposed to trust the Israeli government as the secular government defending Western civilization, you would assume they would treat the church as a non-combatant, as a location where the wounded would be being treated. So logically, these Christians, much like their Archbishop Alexios, who said he would stay with them, they would stay there and care for the people that are wounded, care for the people that are being, there's thousands of wounded. It doesn't matter how many people evacuate already. There's still thousands of people buried under the rubble. So those people need to be able to go somewhere. And these people were then bombed by people who hold antipathy towards the Christian faith explicitly. Literally on Telegram, I'm posting this, and I have Zionists on our Telegram channel laugh reacting to this because I think it's funny that a Christian temple gets, blown up by Zionist Jews. So the fact that they perished under that, I agree, makes them very much contenders for passion bearers. And Archbishop Alexios, who I'm sure had to wipe some dust off his forehead and off of his mantle when all of this cleared off to see and report the tragedy to people in Jordan who first reported that to everybody else. I'm sure when he said that, he knew what he meant.
That's right. We have to also consider just the fact that, look, the reality is the Palestinians, even Hamas itself, did not abuse the Christians of Gaza or anywhere in the even in the West Bank. In fact, Palestinians and Christians have lived side by side for quite some time, at least since the beginning of the State of Israel. We can even say since World War One ended and the Ottoman Empire fell apart, Christians and Muslim Arabs have lived side by side for essentially almost 100 years now, you can say, since the 1920s, with no conflict whatsoever. And the fact that, and this Church of St. Porphyrius of Gaza allowing refugees in for decades on end, since, at least since the first and second intifada, actually, it was used as to provide refuge. They provided food, water, as well as even housing. I mean, from what I read, Conrad, in some of the reports, they allowed at least if it could fit, at least 1,000 refugees, both in the hall and in the church itself, which is an enormous amount. And they, of course, included not just Christians but Muslims as well. So there was no differentiation. It was a true Christ-like love that the pastor of this church actually showed towards their neighbors. And in fact, yeah, it looks like Israel has punished them for their love, and in fact, yeah, has committed a grave war crime. I mean, there's nothing else to call it. It's bombardment of civilian targets. So again, the world really did condemn it, I think, for the most part. In fact, those countries, even that sided with Israel, really didn't comment on it. In fact, like, we're talking about Joe Biden or even Prime Minister of India, Modi. So those who are very pro-Israeli didn't really speak about this church bombing, and those who are, again, more anti-Israel, in fact, countries like Turkey, who we should discuss a bit later, have in fact condemned it as well, which is, I find it good that the Islamic world has kind of united around the fact that, well, they should be respected as well as the Orthodox churches as well. I think that's a good point of unity. At least, mutual respect should be there.
Well, when it comes to unity, that's a great point. And before I get to Dimitri, I want to hear from you what it really means that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been banned, what that will mean on the ground. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about Patriarch Bartholomew before we move into some real World War III type geopolitics. But I have to bring up, St. Paisios, always relevant. It would be foolish for us to go an episode without thinking of St. Paisios and Metropolitan Neophytos. But St. Paisios, he said, the Jews, inasmuch as they'll have great power and the help of the European leadership, will become proud and insolent, beyond measure, and conduct themselves shamelessly. They'll try to rule Europe. They'll play all sorts of tricks, but the resulting persecutions will lead Christians to unite completely. However, they won't unite in the way desired by those who are now engaging in various machinations to create a single church united under a single religious leadership. Christians will unite because the unfolding situation will naturally separate the sheep from the goats. Then the prophecy, one flock and one shepherd, will actually come to pass. And I think in many ways he is talking about something that just occurred, which is the schism, the 10-year-long schism between the Jerusalem Patriarchate and the Patriarchate of Antioch has been healed. As of October 20th, the Antiochian Patriarchate and their synod met and decided that they wanted to end the schism that had been ongoing with the Jerusalem Patriarchate, which was actually happening over the issue of Qatar. And Qatar is technically the jurisdiction of the Antiochian Patriarchate, but what had happened was the Jerusalem Patriarchate had sent a hieromonk there, and they had then elevated him to the position of metropolitan. This was Archimandrite Makarios. They used him to create an archdiocese of Qatar and consecrate him as metropolitan of Qatar, just one guy of one person for a whole metropolis. But in Antioch, they have a few people, they have a few priests and people there, so they didn't appreciate that. But the Antiochian Patriarch today released a statement, and we're recording this October 20th, so that's why I say today. They say, the fathers of the Holy Synod of Antioch raise fervent prayers to the King of Peace and the Lord of Mercies to wipe away every tear from the eyes of the Palestinian people and to remove all injustice, oppression, homelessness, and displacement. They call on all their children to consecrate next Sunday in all the parishes of the Antiochian See for raising prayers that God may grant justice and peace in the land of peace, and to collect aid donations to relieve this afflicted people. Understanding that the current circumstances require intensification of prayer and cooperation, the Holy Synod decided to restore the severed ecclesiastical relations with the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. The Synod assigned the committee in charge of the Patriarchate to communicate with the brethren of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem to solve the dispute over ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Qatar, thus preserving the right of ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Antiochian See. The Synod also decided to send a search delegation to visit Amman, expressing love for the people of the Antiochian See to the people of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and standing by them in these difficult and crucial circumstances. So, anti-Zionism has literally healed a schism in the church. What say you, papists? We don't need an infallible vicar on earth to heal schisms and to heal, splits between people. This is, unironically though, this is the Holy Spirit at work, and this is a very good thing to see.
That's right, and God does use tragedy sometimes to bolster the faithful and to heal certain wounds, and it does seem like somewhat contradictory. But what we're seeing in the Ukraine, I'm not sure what exactly will come of this. Frankly, as you mentioned, it is probably the biggest move of persecution we've seen so far. And yes, it sounds a bit redundant because we've spoken about Ukraine actually banning organizations linked to Russia, and that took place in December 2022 when Zelensky announced actually by decree that the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine can impose personal sanctions on representatives, so individuals. This is why bishops and priests have been taken to trial multiple times. So individuals as well as organizations, as in small groups, for example, like coffee hour groups or any extra like children's camps, any like laity clubs which are found to be associated with Russia, could be persecuted. Now, the Ukrainian High Rada has voted on actually making illegal. It has qualified that the entire Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is under Metropolitan Onufri, has been technically found to be complicit in being tied to Russia. So now the entire organization of the church is legal. Well, technically. And what does that mean, like practically on the ground? Well, fortunately, and again, this is providential perhaps, but Ukraine has a different church diocese control model to the Russian Federation and even Belarus. So around 1948, after World War II, Saint Luke of Crimea famously proposed to the Russian Synod to Patriarch Alexios. This is around, the Stalin was still alive back then, but he proposed to Patriarch Alexios I that Russia actually change its model from decentralized parish controls, where every parish has its own budget, every parish has its own council, and every parish has essentially a portion of land, and it's signed on as real estate to the parish. So the parish controls its own land and property. He asked that this model be changed to a more centralized diocese control. So the actual diocese center, the cathedral, controls all the other small parishes, could be even hundreds of churches, and they will answer. They're all owned by one particular council, one particular boss, which is the bishop. And I mean, both of these models have a right to exist, and I'm sure different countries in the Orthodox world have different models, right? Especially in America, God knows how exactly this particular system functions, right? So, but in Ukraine, funny enough, this decentralized model persisted, even though Russia in the 1990s has moved on to the centralized diocese model. In Ukraine, every single parish, and as I mentioned, there are between 10 and 12,000 parish communities across all of Ukraine, have a decentralized control model, which is why even the schism, when it has spread since 2018 and even prior to that, during the fake false patriarch Philaret schism, the schism spread very slowly. It was parish to parish. There was none of this business where one bishop would go into schism and hundreds of parishes would follow him. No, every parish has a council and a priest and a deacon, and they can decide for themselves, do they want to follow their bishop into schism, or do they want to simply disconnect themselves from the rotten corpse? And in fact, this is essentially what this means for this persecution bill, is now that every parish, there will be an investigation committee, and they'll be looking at every single parish, thousands of parishes around Ukraine, and investigating whether or not they're tied to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which of course they are, frankly, because that's the church they're under. All their documents are signed, and they're all mentioning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They can't hide, they can't lie about this. And so they're going to persecute one parish at a time, and it'll be a very slow burn type persecution. This is not going to be a broad ban. It'll take many years. I mean, God forbid that the Ukrainian war continues and Russia remains without victory and without freeing the Ukrainian Orthodox people. But let's just say that it does continue. It'll take a few years for them to get through. I mean, it could even take a decade to get through hundreds and thousands of Ukrainian parishes around all of Ukraine. So it is a very Soviet type, catacomb type persecution which will start taking place. And they'll be taking many priests and many deacons and many parish council members to court saying that, look, you're the treasurer of this parish. Are you associated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Metropolitan University? He'll say yes. Okay, you're going to jail for 2-3 years. You're being fined $5,000-$10,000. There'll be those sort of offenses. It'll be very tough and a lot of pressure. And again, this is the demonic side of it, Conrad. How do you get yourself out of this situation very easily and swiftly? You join the schism. You join Metropolitan Epiphany Schism, the false metropolitan. So you have to join Zelensky's pocket SBU church, and all these problems will disappear. Can you imagine the pressure now on those communities which are weak in the faith? As Patriarch Kirill has just stated, he said, this whole conflict, it preys on those who are weak in the faith in Ukraine. Those badly catechized, those without little faith, like Christ spoke about, Apostle Peter. Those who doubt will fall away very quickly. And this is, again, it's unfortunate on one hand that it's so disconnected, and it'll take a while for this particular state apparatus to get to everybody. But at the same time, it spells great pressure on the Orthodox Christians. So we have to pray for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and Metropolitan Onufry may be one of the first people to actually be prosecuted. And again, monasteries as well. This involves monasteries, which the Lavras are going to go. The tens of hundreds of monasteries will be affected. This will be very far-reaching. And this event, it started in December last year, but it's finally reached its apex here. We're almost at the end of this year, so it's almost taken an entire year of persecution to build up to this point of huge tragedy for the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine.
No, it truly is a tragedy, and I wish that I could say that what St. Paisios said and that has now been fulfilled between Antioch and Jerusalem could be true for the Russian and Greek churches, but alas, it appears that the Ecumenical Patriarch is, I hate to say this, but perhaps too far gone at this point to be brought back into the fold of Orthodoxy that is now truly uniting. The Patriarchate of Antioch, without hesitation, in their love for the Patriarch of Jerusalem, put aside this minor territorial dispute and immediately resumed communion, and is like, we'll figure that out later. Is this unprecedented banning of an entire canonical body and an oft considered saintly hierarch within Metropolitan Onufry, did this cause contrition and a looking inwards from those in the Fanar and Patriarch Bartholomew? Unfortunately, I can report no such thing. This is from the Union of Orthodox Journalists. On October 15th, 2023, after the liturgy at the Cathedral of the Holy Apostles Andrew and Great Martyr Dimitri, this is in Madrid, Patriarch Bartholomew told the clerics of the Spanish and Portuguese metropolis of the Ecumenical Patriarchate that he considers the criminal prosecution of Ukrainian Orthodox Church hierarchs to be fair and justified. This is a source from the metropolis that reported this. According to Patriarch Bartholomew, he believes that the reports in the international media about the unfairness of the persecutions of Metropolitan Paul, Metropolitan Jonathan, Metropolitan Theodosi, Metropolitan Yosef, and Metropolitan Longin have no grounds. The head of the Ecumenical Patriarchate is convinced that all of them have violated Ukrainian law and should be held accountable for their actions. As previously reported, the head of the Ecumenical Patriarchate hopes for a meeting with the Pope in Kiev. And yet again, this is from the Union of Orthodox Journalists. They don't really get things wrong. They're all on the ground in Ukraine. So, unfortunately, it seems that we are moving headlong towards that fearful 2025, when it appears that what appears to be an apostate branch of the Eastern Church will be joining the demon in the West. That whore.
Yeah, that's right. This is really unfortunate news, given that Patriarch Bartholomew, we've spoken about him with Father Trifon on our previous episode. We've spoken about Patriarch Bartholomew with Father John very briefly, and just generally we always give His Eminence, the Patriarch of Constantinople and Istanbul, a way out. We're always expecting a comeback moment, but it seems that the hole is being dug deeper and deeper, and he's digging his own spiritual grave here. And we can't be teachers of bishops and patriarchs here, and that is not even our goal, but his own synod, his council, allows him to move forward with these stupid and destructive heretical ideas. And in fact, at this point, he's I don't know if it's a heresiarch himself, but it's at least he's a promulgator of schism. And in fact, now he supports the outright persecution of Orthodox bishops in Ukraine, who he probably has not even met. I doubt Patriarch Bartholomew has read their cases or has at least read exactly what they're being persecuted for. So prosecuted for, legally speaking. I mean, he's claiming that it's all justified. Like, have Patriarch Bartholomew, I doubt you've read Bishop Longin's court documents, even like a summary brief of why he's been in prison, or even Bishop Theodosius, who was acquitted recently. Like, again, there's nobody is really looking into the details. And Patriarch Bartholomew, and I'm tired of using excuses as well for His Eminence Patriarch Bartholomew, because people keep saying that, oh well, he's being blackmailed, or he's being they're using they're bribing him, or he's just senile like Joe Biden, right? It's just dementia, or he's very sick, like somebody said, yeah, like he's sick with cancer, he's going for chemo. It doesn't matter what the excuse is. The saints, I mean, Saint Nectarius had cancer as well. Saint Paisios passed away from cancer. The people, bishops, monks, monastics, clergymen, we're all human. Laymen, we all get sick, we all die. Our minds also perish over time. Saint Vladimir Bogoyevlensky, the one who spread the protocols throughout Russia, towards the end, he was also going a little bit senile, and he had somewhat of dementia. And before he was martyred by the Bolsheviks, one of the first bishops to die, he was the Bishop of Moscow, but he was very right-wing, very much part of the Black Hundreds, but he was also, he made some mistakes towards the end, and he's a saint in our church. But yes, even he had a bit of, they were saying towards the end, he was getting a little bit hazy, his mind. He couldn't, properly give forward his ideas. So it is possible that Patriarch Bartholomew is, receiving a Biden-esque type, I don't know what you would call it, like a grooming of sorts, where the people around him, these archons, these dark, I wouldn't even say they're Greeks, because these people betray the Byzantine idea, the Roman Greek ideals every turn. These are real Hellenic pagan type characters who are pushing Patriarch Bartholomew into, on the road to hell. I mean, that's explicitly what they're doing. And in fact, he's meeting with Zelensky, he's meeting with all these really bizarre figures, heads of CIA, and this is of course really negative, frankly. So we do have to pray for Patriarch Bartholomew, but at this point we just have to constitute that, look, he has overstepped. This is a boundary which I don't think the Russian Church will forgive. Patriarch Bartholomew, by all accounts, for doing what he's done now, for saying these things, for promoting schism, he needs to go into a monastery detention forever. Like, he needs to retire, and he needs to forcibly be retired by his own synod. This is the solution. That's his best outcome, to pray away his sins like Saint Mary of Egypt, somewhere in the desert, on Mount Athos perhaps. But to sort of die on the chair of the ecumenical patriarch would probably not serve him well. Not in his spiritual, not even in terms of his mental health, because imagine the pressure he's dealing with. Like, he's literally talking to complete degenerates, American politicians, great members of the Greek liberal parties, various schismatics and degenerates from Ukraine. It's just very destructive for himself. And again, it's shameful for us as well as Orthodox Christians that the highest judicial power in our church, which is the ecumenical patriarch, who can hear church appeals at the highest level, is actually that seat is held by a man such as him. So again, there's no real solution here except for his own synod. His own local church needs to address his particular shortcomings, and they're just not doing that. In fact, and they're all liable for this as well, naturally.
And look, as of right now, again, we're getting closer to 2025 when this could be a breaking point, and as of now, it would appear that it would be the Fanar Go Arch, which I guess would include a lot of the people in the United States. Again, though, this bishop by bishop, it would really break down to the point where I think the only people that would join with Patriarch Bartholomew would be him, the Fanariates, some of the Alexandrian bishops, and some of the Cypriot bishops, and maybe some of the bishops under Greece. I don't think all of the Greek bishops. I know not all of the Cypriot bishops. And I know probably most of the sub-Saharans would just join the African Exarchate. So if you take that into account, if we somehow got into communion with the Malankara, let alone something happening with the Ethiopians, the Orthodox Church around the world would still be much larger than what it was before that small group of modernists and crypto-papists decided to abandon the faith. So again, we don't hope for anything like that to happen, but it does appear that if that is the path that some wish to go down, it will very much be, as St. Paisios said, a separation of the sheep from the goats. But unless you have anything else to say in that regard, Dimitri, it's time to get into some of the world geopolitics here, the real politique, and that involves Putin discussing. This was right after America sent its eastern, the Eisenhower and the Ford, after those arrived in the eastern Mediterranean. Putin announced that he would be flying MiG bombers in the neutral zone in the southern Black Sea, right off the coast of Turkey, which means that those bombers are then in range of the carriers that are in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Putin said this very casually. He said this, just he literally says like, I don't mean to alarm anybody, but we're doing this, and that was that. And he basically was just making the message clear that we're watching this very closely and we're aware of the World War III implications that are going on in the Levant right now.
Yeah, just before I mentioned the fact that David Erhan's going to look out his window one day and see top tier Russian fighter planes flying, near the south of the Bosphorus, along through the Trebizond, past Istanbul. Yeah, before I mention that, I think it's very nice, generally in the Greek world, to see the two, I guess, most persecuted and most highly pressured churches, so the Church of Jerusalem and the Church of Antioch, unite again. Because, in fact, these two are the most pro Russian churches, but also the two most conservative churches. If you think about it, Cyprus would also be a close candidate, but they're unfortunately too tied into the Ecumenical Patriarch, and their recent the recent failure to elect Metropolitan Neophytus of Morphu, has kind of shown itself. But we'll see what exactly transpires. But out of the 5 or 6 local Greek jurisdictions, I would say that it's a good thing that Jerusalem and Antioch stand united in not just their support for the united Orthodox world, as in everybody should be together with no schisms. They're kind of like the middle ground. They're welcoming everybody, and the Greeks and the Russians and the Slavs, but also just the fact that now they're united amongst themselves. And in fact, they're the ones facing the most pressure from countries such as Turkey, ISIS, now Israel, the Zionists. So it's really quite heartwarming. But generally about the MiGs, I mean, that's just intense. Like, you have to consider these are not just fighter planes who shoot missiles which fly about 100 meters or even 1 kilometer. These MiGs have these MiG fighter planes have the capacity to hold Kinjal missiles, and Kinjal missiles are a new technology which only Russia has. Frankly, I don't think any other country on Earth, including America, actually has developed hypersonic missiles of this level. Russia has tested this many times in secret facilities all over Siberia. I mean, this is the official take, that these missiles actually do fire at super fast speeds. They can bypass any missile defense system in the world because they just fly very fast. I mean, I'm using layman's terms here, but the plane essentially launches this missile. It flies in a straight line very, very quickly, bypasses any defense system, hits the target, causes a gigantic explosion, and it can fly up to 1,000 kilometers in fury. So we're talking about, if it shoots that missile over Turkey, it could literally hit the aircraft carrier on, I mean, distance-wise, I mean, you can calculate for yourself. Look at a map. It's frankly a huge range. So this is a direct statement by Putin that he's willing to actually fly his strongest weapon. This is Russia's, besides nuclear missiles, these hypersonic Kinjal missiles attached to these planes is the most powerful thing Russia has. And in fact, many have said this is why America hasn't responded, like with troops on the ground in any place like Ukraine and Crimea, because it's actually afraid of what these missiles could do to aircraft carriers or to even American fleets, because there is no real way to defend yourself against missiles that fly that quickly. Even if Russia has only a few of them, it's simply too much of a threat. So I think Putin has really made a statement. And again, we'll speak about what Stelkov and other military analysts think about this particular conflict or what it could turn into. But we should consider that, yes, this is a very brave moment by Putin. And I think it's very commendable, in fact, because he's making a statement. He's like, look, America isn't the boss of the Middle East anymore. We aren't living in 2003. You can't just invade Syria. Because again, these aircraft carriers, they're a threat to Syria as well as they are to the Palestinians, and as well as they are to Lebanon and Hezbollah, etc. Not that Putin really wants to support Hezbollah, but all things need to be considered. We don't know. America is literally run by a senile old man who's controlled by a group of Epsteinian-type Satanists. I mean, this is very, in raw terms, that's what's happening. And I think Putin knows that. And he's afraid he just needs to make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed.
Yeah, again, this is Putin is very much aware of the broad consequences. Again, we wonder, is he reading the prophecies? Is he aware of the eschatological realities? I mean, we hope so, right? But of course there is Netanyahu talking about this being a long war. We are all not eagerly, we're all nervously awaiting the ground offensive, which could start at any time. We know Biden's recent visit to Israel has kind of put that on hold. The international community, I mean, between the church bombings and the hospital bombings and the convoy bombings and just the general nastiness from people like Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin, people just kind of seeing these mask-off moments. The U.S. knows that they got to follow Israel into this fire no matter what, so they want it to be done on their terms without anything crazy. And some of the more ethno-narcissistic Zionists are having a hard time, holding back like that. But it's just important to also realize that I talked about St. Seals predicting some of this, and remember, he did talk about wars in the Middle East and things like this happening. But, Metropolitan Nofritos, February 3rd, 2023. I mean, he talks about explicitly, like, the interviewer literally asks him, like, I'm worried about Israel and Iran. And he literally says, he's like, oh, are you not worried about Israel? And the person says, yes, I am worried. And he's like, worry more about it. Worry about Israel and Persia. And then he goes on and he says, thus the war that takes place in Syria, the war that takes place in Ukraine, the war that will start in the whole Middle East soon, and the Chinese will take part in this war, this is how it will turn into a world war. The question must be why God allowed for a third world war to start. The Ukrainian issue is a part of the Third World War. It is not the beginning, neither is it the end. St. John the Russian, and this is from a conversation that St. Yakovos told him that St. Yakovos had with St. John the Russian. He said, the pilgrims there are many, Father Yakovos, but the faithful are only a few. The world is full of impiety, immorality, and unfaithfulness. For this world to be fixed, there must be a war. And this, Metropolitan Neophytos was talking about a war in Russia and Ukraine, especially regarding the Ukraine schism issue in, February of 2022. Earlier, February 17th is when translations of his speeches from January and late 2022 were translated into English. Father Elpidios Vagianakis also was talking about this war, months before February 2022 occurred. So the children of these saintly elders, especially in Greece, the children of the Athonite tradition really saw this coming. And Metropolitan Neophytos also saw what's going on in Israel coming. And unfortunately, his words lead me to believe that within the next year, there's no way that Iran doesn't get involved in this somehow. And that, of course, does directly involve the United States.
The prophecies for told by the Russian saints very much, and this is how they're all related, and the saints speak with the inspiration and of course the participation of the Holy Spirit to speak with God's grace, is because they all align in and of themselves. Like you can see, the prophecies they're all attached together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and it helps you build a picture. God is trying to inform us that there are really important things that will take place in the future that people need to be aware of, and not to, on one hand, not to despair, on the other hand, to have hope, and of course be prepared. And the Lord's main purpose here naturally is for our salvation and for our repentance. So all of this is not for some sort of worldly glory or for epic events to take place, but it's for us lay people to not despair when these events do take place. Even a slight warning, even the fact that World War III will take place, and prophecies like the ones of Saint Theophan of Poltava about the coming of a new Russian Tsar from the Romanov dynasty. These are all great, but even Theophan of Poltava and other saints, and Theophan of Poltava is buried in France. He was a great Russian White Army emigre and one of the founding members of Rocor as an archbishop, and eventually an ascetic monk. But even the other prophecies of the saints, St. Lawrence of Chernigov, St. Seraphim of Viritsa, they all speak about a coming war which will take place. And they, not all of them specify exactly which countries will be involved, like St. Paisios does, but they do speak about a great war which will come before the next reign of the Orthodox monarch, which will take place after the war. So whatever happens next, I mean, we do have to anticipate that it's just about living a good Orthodox Christian life, living, being as Christian as possible, frankly, despite whatever's happening in the outside world, whatever material hardships will come. And after that, God will give us a small time of rest, and not just us, but the entire world, maybe. But especially Orthodox countries will receive an Orthodox monarch again, and if we deserve one, that is, and if we, of course, survive through repentance and through prayer. And Russia especially will bring God's mercy to the world in terms of spreading Orthodox Christianity and spreading the good news. The gospel will be spread all around, and for a short time, and then the events of the apocalypse will begin. So that's roughly the outline which we see across all Russian prophecies and even the Greek prophecies. And there are, of course, generally speaking, we're not going to go too much into detail, but in a future episode, we'll discuss prophecies relating to figures such as the Marble King and how that could tie into, maybe a reemergence of an old Byzantine emperor similar to the Eups of Ephesus, when a sleeping saint finally awakens and then perhaps lives on Earth for a short period of time and then maybe reposes. But these are all very, very interesting prophecies, and there's a lot of insight there into the future. But we do need to consider the fact that we don't just speak about wars because they're scary or because there's a chance of triumph or there's a chance of defeat or victory for somebody. It's just that God has warned us of these things a long time ago by saints who lived after the Second World War, which was the greatest conflict mankind has ever known in terms of the tragedy and the calamity which it was brought onto the earth. And that was by our sins. So can you imagine, in the sinful, we are a lot more sinful now than humanity was in the 1920s and 30s, despite all the degeneracy that took place then, even in Soviet Russia and Europe, all around the world. But consider these days, like, I mean, even neutral countries, like even countries which are majority pagan and atheistic, there will be the next conflict will be a very serious one, and we have to kind of prepare ourselves. And how do we prepare? We read the saints, we read the Bible, the scripture, attend church while we can, memorize the services. We may not have access to all the service books when things really hit the fan, And I'm not saying this to scare people, but the Holy Spirit has given us this warning, and we should just heed it. And I think the saints, that's where the message comes from, I think.
In previous episode, we talk about a lot of these prophecies, but Metropolitan Neophytos, in his interview in February, he said that the Russian elders predicted this, whether it was Elder Jonah, Elder Zosima, St. Lawrence, St. Seraphim, Abbas Galactia, all these others that he talked about. These are people who, that he knows he's friends with Metropolitan Onufri. He has, as a young man, he was exposed to the saintly elders above him that have already now been canonized. He made it a point to fraternize and become friends with all of the elders of his region especially, and that's the Black Sea, and Ukraine is very much a part of that, and that's why Metropolitan Neophytos is still one of the saintliest hierarchs today, and he has felt so strongly to speak out because he has built relationships with these saintly people across Ukraine and Russia and the Holy Land and everywhere else. But at the end of the day, this is all, this is, as Metropolitan and St. Paisios said, the prophecies become headlines, and it starts to become a little bit odd when, we started this show, we said all these things, and now it's, it feels good, I guess, in a way to be vindicated, but it's also a bit unsettling because the stuff we know comes next starts to get really unpleasant, especially if you listen to last episode and you want to listen to what Elder Joseph of Vatopedi has to say. We hope that, some of that was just, a bit of an exaggeration for an effect to bring repentance about, right? We hope, because, some of the body counts get in the hundreds of millions, and that's nothing that anybody wants to see. But when it comes to the situation as of right now, of course, Biden has just left Israel. He was not able to meet with Mahmoud Abbas or anyone of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority and the Jordanians canceled on Biden after the bombing of the hospital. That really led to a big response from the Arab world, and the Arab world and the Muslim world in general, frankly, is more united than ever. I think a lot of the responses from Turkey and Egypt, who have really been a lot more neutral on this issue and even considered allies of Israel and the United States in the region, their strong response, I think, really frightened a lot of people, of course. And as of right now, it appears that the U.S. is the one urging caution. All of the leadership, whether it's Netanyahu or Gallant or Gavir, they're all ready to go in on this ground invasion. The U.S. is just like, look, I think Biden, even hinted that if you guys go all in on this ground invasion like this, we may not help you if Hezbollah responds in kind. That may not be a guarantee of U.S. support. And that probably shook Netanyahu a little bit and made him start to reconsider. But as far as, we of course had Blinken was there, Biden obviously going there as well. Rishi Sunak went there, and Rishi Sunak, compared to Biden, was much more, prostrative towards Israel. It proves that the UK is even more of a colony of Israel in many ways, has been for such a long time. It shows those Nathan Rothschild roots, right after Meyer Amschel. It really, really goes back. But, he prostrated himself to Netanyahu, really stood with them. Whereas Biden, in one of his later statements, actually, he did talk about, freedom for the Palestinians, them having their own state, Islamophobia as well as anti-Semitism, which I'm sure did not make any of the Jews happy. But, in many ways, there's even talk of, all these young staffers in the White House are incensed with how much support is being given towards Israel. So it just shows you that after the boomer generation, the Israel worship from the public in America is totally out the window. But as far as the Islamic world uniting, we saw the black flags of mourning, which is usually then followed by war, flying over their most relevant mosques. And I think in the immediate Iran is having to kind of restrain its proxies, the ones it has in Iraq, and the Houthis, because they're just wanting to go to war. They're just wanting to go all out on Israel. The Houthis, who we know basically won their counterinsurgency against the Saudi-backed forces in Yemen. The Houthis control you could guys call it the westernmost third or quarter of Yemen, and they're directly funded by Iran and have some pretty powerful missiles, but they really destroyed a lot of U.S. artillery because the U.S. was funding Saudi Arabia's war against the Houthis in Yemen for a long, long time. But the Houthis, they launched missiles over the Red Sea at Israel just because they declared solidarity with the Palestinians, and a U.S. carrier and ships had to shoot those down. And the Houthis they went all in. And at this point as well, the militias in Iraq, specifically the Sunni Iranian-funded ones, have all united. They have formed a united front, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which previously, this is a new kind of united, I don't know how many the numbers are exactly, but they have launched at least 8 rockets and drone attacks against U.S. troops within Syria and Iraq over the last 72 hours. And all of this is after the al-Aqsa flood operation, and I believe the Iranian proxies formed an al-Aqsa flood support operation room. Like they kind of grouped together and have been piecing this new element of what they call the axis of resistance together now. And so basically with the Syrian Arab Army in Syria, there's other Iranian proxies there that may need to unite. Now we have a united front in Iraq, Hezbollah, and then Hamas. It seems that these forces are uniting to put even more pressure on Israel, which I think Iran's idea is that this will cause Israel to go much more gentle on their ground invasion and really be unable to effectively take over. But there are reports now that Israel and the United States want to work with some of the more sympathetic, more Western sympathetic Arab countries in the United Nations to form an interim government, which, would satisfy, I guess, some of the Western and Israeli desires, which is all anti-Hamas. They want to just get rid of Hamas, get out of Hamas. So then I guess if they could set up a sort of, something akin to the fake Belarusian government in exile, or, the fake Burmese, Myanmar government that they still recognize over there, something like that for Gaza and Palestine, then that would give Hamas even less legitimacy and give a more peaceful option. Maybe it would allow maybe Egypt and these other places to take in more Palestinian refugees, which that's the big thing. Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, they aren't going to take any of these Palestinian refugees. Egypt said it views that as a declaration of war from Israel to force them to take 1 million+ Palestinians. So that is really where the rub kind of hits. And I don't know how that's going to necessarily resolve itself, but it's very much in flux right now.
So I guess we do agree with Egyptian politicians that mass immigration is a form of warfare. I mean, yeah, it's completely right. And the Jordanians, of course, we
Yeah.
felt it like last week, right? We spoke about Black September in Jordan in the 1970s, and how the local Jordanians, and who are really related to the Palestinians almost, like they are Arabs as well, and they speak very, obviously they all speak Arabic, so they're very similar culture-wise, but even they couldn't live alongside the Palestinians in peace because just that the groups are very different. But in fact, in Western countries, we're told multiculturalism is the cream of the crop. It's just the way to go. But these Middle Easterns just simply cannot get along. Even Lebanon itself, which was known for a completely horrendous, bloody Yugoslav level. No offense to Yugoslavia, of course, but that country, of course, naturally constructed by the Tito and the communists, fell apart in a horrendous civil war. Lebanon had a very similar one, and the fears are, right, Conrad? Stelkov mentioned this, who we'll talk about later on, but he does mention that Lebanon, it is the only thing that's really keeping it together is this big Hezbollah factor. So again, these aircraft carriers removing Hezbollah, I think it would be even greater achievement than destroying Hamas, frankly, in the south and in Gaza. If Hezbollah is completely destroyed, the United States and Israel, they get rid of an enemy who not only is funded by Iran and is more Shia, like religiously, I suppose, more anti-Semitic, you could say, but in fact, it would almost remove any threats from Israel because, again, Syria, as involved as Assad and Syria is in this conflict on the side of, I guess, on the side of the, I guess, Islamic resistance against the state of Israel, they're very weak at the moment, and in fact, they have their own troubles. And given this recent headline here, so the fact that Iraqi Muslim, this new sort of, I wouldn't say it's a new ISIS, because notice ISIS was always somewhat pro-Israel, which gives you the kind of the hint that perhaps ISIS, similar to Al Qaeda, was completely a CIA-run op from the beginning. Because you look, ISIS never had
ISIS actually this past week, ISIS got activated again, suddenly out of nowhere. Why is ISIS attacking Iranian militias in Iraq? It's absurd. Is it that, like, are they really that? Do they really think it's not that obvious? Like, it's ridiculous.
I don't think they even care about that. In fact, look at all the countries who oppose France in the around the ECOWAS and the Sahel belt in Africa, right? Because those African stories didn't stop. In fact, Wagner today is fighting alongside the Malian authorities, and the authorities of Niger are fighting against Al-Qaeda. Listen to these names: Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and some local extremist Islamic African alliances. And it's just like, Right. So the United States, right, met up with France and they said, look, France, Macron said, look, I can't send forces to Africa, but US, can you activate some of your terrorist cells who you formed decades ago and possibly can you use them to disrupt this region here? And US, of course, agreed. But thankfully, Russia's there to, assist the local Africans in order to defend themselves against these. I don't even want to say Muslim extremists because these people are not even real Muslims. In fact, they're just Wahhabists, Salafists. Their religion is even, as we're not Muslim. Me and Conrad aren't Muslims ourselves, but these are even more apostate versions of Islam itself. It's just completely degenerate, CIA created, and this is almost a fact at this point. But yes, ISIS. Now that these Muslim authorities are appearing in Iraq, who are are opposing Israel, I think it's more of a genuine reaction and a much needed one. Because remember, Iraq was a traditional enemy of Israel going back to the 90s. Saddam Hussein, Israel Netanyahu himself personally pushed the entire idea. We spoke about this a few episodes back that Iraq needed to be destroyed. Iraq was planning to build nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, all kinds of bizarre fake news came out, and naturally this was used to spark the post 9/11 tragic Iraq War, which took away millions of lives. So naturally, Israel and the Iraqis don't get along on a very fundamental level, despite what I guess you could say, the puppet government of Iraq would have you think.
Yeah, it's very much. I mean, the whole situation is just really obvious that we talk about this in the Ether Hour that there's a certain, group that really just kind of has its strings all over the world and is able to activate all sorts of groups to distract their enemies, to make their whims occur. And Iran has constructed a very vast web network to prevent a lot of those things from affecting, their goals, which is, disrupting the Zionist entity and maintaining its sphere of influence in Iraq, Syria, and the areas around it, which ultimately this brings us to a sort of a more speculative part and kind of the World War Now analysis you're really listening for. And again, we've seen how strong Turkey has been supporting the Palestinians. It's really like they've been storming U.S. embassies, U.S. citizens and people have been asked to leave Turkey. It's a really big deal. They've destroyed McDonald's. McDonald's in Turkey has fallen. The anti-American rage got so strong. And of course, we saw Tunisia. Just a little. I think of Tunisia and Turkey because the flags look so dang similar. But Tunisia, they started to burn in synagogues in Tunisia. So Tunisia, anytime this type of thing comes, whether it has to do with Africans, sub-Saharan Africans or Jews, they kick the dial up to 11. So Godspeed Tunisia, I guess. But Turkey, it kind of raises the question, if they're really in this for the Palestinians, if they're really willing to threaten Israel, who for them is an ostensible ally, why are they still tying down Assad in the north? Why? I get that they're fighting Kurdish groups, but they're encroaching on Assad's territory. Their militias are causing the Russians to have to hit them with powerful airstrikes. This is keeping Russian and Syrian, pro-Assad forces distracted from what could be, kind of providing cover, providing aid to either the axis of resistance and just the general peacekeeping force, kind of showing Israel that they need to be safe and watch what they're doing, or else something bad could happen. Like, why isn't Turkey doing that if they really are in this for the Palestinians?
I think in short, it probably comes down to political as well as human greed. Frankly, Turkey does want to extend its border. I mean, historically, Turkey did take up all of the Levant, Lebanon, Syria. Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire, as original as Anatolia was. In fact, the Muslim and the Turkic conquest actually came from the south towards the north as they slowly pushed the Byzantines all the way to the Constantinople Peninsula. So, in fact, that entire region was in fact Ottoman Turkish prior to even Turkey proper today, in fact being Turkish. So they consider that as their historical domains, as their backyard. And I guess, perhaps there are some theorists, Turkish theorists, who know this a bit better than myself, but they could speak about some sort of Ottoman resurgence. And there is also, of course, the consideration that Turkey is not friendly with naturally Egypt, the anti-Islamic Brotherhood alliance going on there. So Turkey is very much aligned of the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood and all the entire message there. And again, Turkey was the last legitimate caliphate of the Muslim world until it fell apart after World War One and Ataturk took over. So Turkey does view itself as like it needs to reestablish leadership over the Muslim world, take it away from the Saudis, take it away from any of these bizarre countries like resurging, like some sort of Egypt or, God forbid, even Iran. But at the moment, Turkey and Iran are really on good grounds. But look, this tragedy occurring to the Palestinians, yes, has reunited Turkey greatly. We've seen this past election in May, that's forgotten, right? All of that 50-50 close run, Erdogan and his opponent, it's completely gone. It's Turkey, we've never, I don't think I've ever seen the Turkish people so united. In fact, even David Erhan, I think, speaks about it in some of his tweets, and maybe he'll even make a video about this. But the Turkish people are united around this idea that the Zionists are bullying our younger brothers down south who we used to have domain over. Because before Great Britain created the Mandate of Palestine, which it then sold to the Zionists, or even gave it to the Zionist Jews, Palestine and that land was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Turks remember this because it's probably taught in their history books, it's taught in schools, etc. So they understand this land used to be peaceful under the Turkish Ottoman regime, which I think me and you, Conrad, would probably agree, because look, that's when the majority of, I guess, even Russian Orthodox and the Jerusalem Patriarchate, look, it took about 600 years, but even the Greek Orthodox Church worked out a very solid relationship with the local Turkish authorities. Like, there were periods of persecution and there was, tensions here and there, but eventually they worked out a relationship. And then suddenly everything gets twisted. Lebanon goes into a civil war. Syria gets destroyed. Antioch is wiped off the face of the earth. All these events occur, and suddenly the Middle East is collapsing. And simply because, well, somebody post World War II wanted to create an Israeli state, as well as dissect this, whatever was left of the Ottoman Empire, according to some non-Christian designs. The dissection that we see of the Middle East today is anti-Turkish, but it's also anti-Orthodox in a way, because it prevents any sort of peace. It prevents missionary work. It's a cauldron of chaos. And the only people who benefit seem to be the globalists, as well as the Zionist Israelis, who actually, are winning based on this. And Turkey understands. So Turkey has its own eschatological Mahdi type. They see Israel as probably the throne of the future Dajjal, or in their view, the Antichrist. So I think Turkish furiously, Turkish geopoliticians, they probably have their own Dugans sitting there working things out, like, long term. I think they're playing the long chess game. They understand that Turkey will need to play a huge role in the future of Islam and the future of the Middle East. And I don't think they're going to, the fact that in Azerbaijan just beat Armenia as well, and they see Azerbaijan as a certain fiefdom as well, I think it all plays into it. This grandiose idea of power. Again, when they step against Greece, that's when the prophecies kick in. So as soon as Turkey looks west as opposed to south, we're going to see some really eschatological events take place, even more so than now.
And we know, it's all leaning towards a Russia-Turkey clash, but in many ways it seems that perhaps for it to get there, we might have to see a Turkish-Iran clash. And of course, we mentioned that choke point for Turkey and Iran is Azerbaijan. And the question becomes, like, perhaps we might see, Turkey, in this united front with all the people against Israel, against the Zionist Authority. Perhaps it commits troops to places with a treaty, thinks that places where you think they would be neutral and everything. But then perhaps maybe Erdogan dies, and then a new pro-Western group is able to take power, and those troops are then able to be used for purposes against Iran, against Russian forces or anything. These are all, we're getting very speculative here, but we know Iran and Turkey are not exactly allies. And again, like, the Turks are different from the Persians, or different from the Arabs. Like, these are the three big Muslim groups that in spite of everything have truly been united against the Zionist entity, and thus against America, despite, in theory, the Americans hoping to have both the Turks and the Arabs on their side against the Persians. So it's really come around on America. And this is not the post 9/11 moment anymore. It's the post COVID, post Ukraine moment, which is just a totally different animal. So, and Dimitri, I think a certain character that we like to keep up with had similar ideas about how Iran and Turkey, how this all might go.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning our comrade in arms, who is currently being detained unlawfully by the Russian legal system, and the Russian Attorney General, the chief prosecutor of the Russian Federation, Igor Strelkov, of course, has given his opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And why we listen to him, well, naturally, we've spoken about him many times. He's probably the foremost Orthodox layman, I guess you could say, expert on everything geopolitical, and the voice that we trust, given that he's an Orthodox monarchist, he's spoken to Orthodox elders all over eastern Ukraine. He is a voice who I think we can give credence to, and who we can trust. And in fact, his opinion really hasn't changed since I started following him in 2013. So in fact, he has a history, a 10-year-long consistent opinions, which I think we follow, even if we disagree with him on simple things. It doesn't really matter. He's a trustworthy person to listen to. Now, his recent analysis was quite a similar one to my own and Conrad. I think he essentially spoke. He said that, look, The conflict cannot be resolved through negotiations for two main reasons. Israel cannot swallow the consequences of the Hamas attack, naturally, we agree, because it was externally and internally showed Israel to have a critical weakness as well, naturally, and the entire Muslim world has seen Israel actually bleed. More than 1,000 people have already perished, and it has shown that, Israel, it's like that, like the ending of the movie 300, right? When Leonidas throws a spear at Xerxes' face. But that's a bit of a pop culture reference, which I don't think we'll make anymore. But it has shown Israel that, look, there is a chance that even with their modern equipment, the Israeli army can in fact take a beating from understaffed, undermanned Hamas militants, and this of course has given hope. Now Stelkov continues, says that essentially Israeli society is very vengeful and calling for all the Israeli debts to be avenged, which again we expect that to be the case. Naturally, we agree. Stelkov goes on to say that, of course, factually speaking, Russia is in a very tight and essentially a military alliance with two countries which are actively involved with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a rhetorical basis as well as probably even a funding basis. Syria is assisting Hezbollah, as well as Iran is assisting Hezbollah. Iran and Syria are both Russian allies at the moment. So Russia has a really strong tie to the conflict, and naturally how it disconnects from this, it's not really clear. Stelkov's opinion also is that Russia should, under no circumstances, should Russia get involved in the current conflict. This is a very interesting protectorate type of position. He said the conflict makes no sense on any level. Nobody benefits from it. Israel doesn't benefit. The US doesn't benefit, EU doesn't benefit. It feels very eschatological, he says. And he says that a lot of conspiracy theories, of course, abound. He states that the fact that Hamas has succeeded in this attack obviously shows the unprecedented incompetence of both the CIA and Mossad. And in his personal opinion, this provocation by Hamas would not have been possible without either one, intentional negligence from these intelligence agencies, or two, an actual involvement of Israel and Mossad working together with Hamas, maybe through plans or through some sort of federal agents infiltrating Hamas and actually pushing this idea that we're going to make this attack succeed and orchestrating it, because it's unprecedented. It's impossible for this attack to succeed that well, given the fact that Israel has always kept a very strong stance down there in the south around Gaza. Not saying that's a good thing, it's just simply stating a fact here. Naturally, Igor Stelkov moves on to say that Russia, of course, is in a very tight situation with Turkey. And this has always been the fact since the Russian involvement in the Syrian conflict. The fact that Russian supply lines and logistics depend on going through the Bosphorus Strait, through the Mediterranean, again, from the Syrian port, the Mediterranean, through the Bosphorus into the Black Sea. That's the only way Russia can really supply its forces in Syria, including the Russian aircraft, which is stationed in Syria at the moment, as well as any on-ground personnel they have there. It's a very tough supply line, and Turkey is a natural ally of NATO and of the United States. So, and naturally, a grain deal complicates things. So Russia cannot even get involved in this conflict. Again, open question. Stelkov doesn't really answer it. He says that if Russia does get involved, it will need to give massive concessions to Turkey, similar to the ones given in the Karabakh conflict. So Stelkov believes, of course, that Russia completely consented to Azerbaijan, who was a very close ally of Turkey, of giving them Nagorno-Karabakh and that entire region. And I think that's probably true. Russia didn't get involved in fact, it's peacekeepers. Remember what happened to the peacekeepers who were killed? And we're not even sure who even killed them in the first place. Was it Turkish personnel? Was it Azerbaijanis? But the Russian peacekeepers were a completely null and ignored point. And I think that speaks to the fact that Russia was essentially gave Azerbaijan and Turkey a free card here. And in fact, many of those free cards, which again speaks to northern Syria, Stelkov's analysis says that, look, Russia will need to give consents to Turkey and Syria. So in fact, maybe a lot of northern Syria will need to be conceded to Turkey if Russia becomes involved in this conflict in the Middle East. Very, very tough decisions. It's not very easy for Russia to act. And he says, and this is the very key point here, Stelkov's third point, in the Russian Federation itself, there has always been, and it has not gone away recently, a very powerful Jewish lobby in government bodies, at the top of business and especially in the mainstream media. At the same time, tens of millions of the Muslim population, indigenous as well as newcomers, so we're talking about the mass immigration, right? This is me throwing in my opinion. The Chechens, the Dagestanis, obviously the Tatars, they want Russia to go and assist the Palestinians, but how can Russia do this if its elite is tied in with the Jewish powerful businessmen and media stars in Russia itself? Very, very tough. naturally newcomers. We're talking about the Kyrgyz, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the people from Kazakhstan who are essentially crowding all of southern Russia and Siberia, and there's this mass immigration issue is an entirely different point. But still, their opinions need to be considered because these people are fervent Muslims and they want Russia to assist them. They're of course parading around, giving their opinions online as well as in person. Stelkov continues and says close economic ties with the Arab oil producing powers as well need to be considered, which Russia, again, is a big seller of oil, crude oil, as well as processed oil, many of which will inevitably be drawn into the conflict, many of these Muslim nations. Under these conditions, it'll be extremely difficult for the Russian Federation to occupy a neutral position and avoid being drawn into the conflict, either on the side of Israel or on the side of the Arabs, because Russia has these two big drawing points. One is the Jewish oligarchate, and if you look at the Forbes 100 list, most of those oligarchs who are listed as Russian have a dual Russian-Israeli citizenship. This needs to be considered, including Michael Friedman. The fourth largest bank in Russia is run by a man named Michael Friedman, who's recently been accused of collaborating with the Ukraine, but that's a different story. But Michael Friedman is a Russian-Israeli dual citizen. Like, how does that even work? So you're telling me one of the largest banks is run by somebody with mixed allegiances in Russia itself? Very, very strange position, again. But Stilko was completely right. This lobby inside of Russia will cause great problems, considering Russia is really, naturally the only position it has to defend the Syrians, but how does it get involved here? It really shouldn't. And again, his opinion is that Russia should stay out of it. I think that's generally the analysis that he gives here. I can't really say that he's wrong, but I guess we'll see how this plays out. He's obviously not giving any predictions, mainly just assessing the situation as it is based on the facts given.
Well, and he makes a big point that Russia needs to focus on Ukraine. And right now, it does seem that there are some pretty strong movements being made in Donetsk region towards Avdiivka. Dmitry might have a few more details on that as well, but Shelkov continues to say, the China, Iran, Russia axis. He's pretty confident that that is a fairly unassailable alliance these days. And again, Iran's presence in the region is really going to be key in dragging, both of those characters into a place where they may not want to be dragged. And of course, the U.S. is now saying that they're trying to get more and more aid, like huge aid for Ukraine and Israel now. Janet Yellen, Jewish Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, says that we can afford to fund a two-front war in Ukraine and in Israel. Of course, I wonder why she might have an interest in funding those two specific wars. But of course, the Gentiles in the State Department insist that our focus is China, but I don't think that can be sated anymore. I think China is really looking at Taiwan, and they've got to be looking at those Kinmen Islands. Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to really go to war with us over some islands right off of our coast? So Xi Jinping, we're all curious, but I think this is interesting. This was posted on CIG, and this is just terrible stuff, Support for Hamas and anti-Semitism. Social networks in China during the war in Israel. China's social media trends amidst the outbreak of the war in Israel provide troubling insights into the initial sentiments of Chinese netizens, including but not limited to a concerning layer of anti-Semitic rhetoric being shared on a relatively wide scale. Support for the terrorist organization Hamas, as well as the justification of the mass murder of Jews, was alarmingly prevalent throughout the comments of most of the related Weibo posts. Chinese netizens called for Hamas to continue launching rockets at Israel and expressed hopes that Hamas could destroy Israel once and for all. The sentiment was heavily intertwined with and reinforced by a disturbing mixture of anti-Semitic tropes, hate speech, sexual objectification, and references to the Holocaust with anti-Semitic symbols like swastikas and references to Adolf Hitler. The Chinese censors have not deleted or blocked these posts, while at the same time, posts telling the Israeli story are being blocked. The Chinese sentiment points to a coming decoupling between Israel and China. To Israel, Beijing is not a neutral country anymore, nor is it relevant to the Middle East future peace process. I highly doubt Israel liked China facilitating Saudi-Iranian rapprochement before their big supposed deal with Saudi Arabia, which has now been completely destroyed. And again, maybe China's going to be in one of those positions like Egypt, like Jordan, like some of these Islamic countries, Saudi Arabia, that by their population alone will be dragged into supporting Palestine. Maybe the Chinese, they're not even Muslim, but they seem to really be passionate against the Israeli cause, because I think they understand the true roots of the unipolarity versus multipolarity strike. But I think before we talk about a few other interesting tidbits of information and maybe talk about the East a little bit more, we've got to talk about Avdiivka.
Yes, of course. Avdiivka, the cauldron is closing on this Ukrainian defense outpost, which has been bombarding Donetsk for the last over 5 years consistently. Now the Russians are closing in on it. Just recently, just actually a few hours ago, the Russian Ministry of Defense has announced that it has assaulted 32 defense positions of Ukraine between Avdiivka and Klishchiivka. There's two villages, and Avdiivka is more of a town, but Klishchiivka is more of a village, I guess. And 155 Ukrainian troops have been killed in one fell swoop. So the Russians are definitely closing in. They want this local victory, similar to Solidar back in the day prior to Bakhmut falling. And I think it would boost Russian morale quite a bit and put something positive into the news stream that, look, the Russians are not just wasting taxpayer dollars. And, frankly, this could be a precursor. The fall of Avdiivka in the northern Donetsk Oblast and just being north of Donetsk, not only are there going to be military triumph parades in Donetsk itself, but also there'll be, if they do catch any sort of, Azov battalion, right sector officials, there's probably going to be trials as well as potential, maybe even capital punishment executions of these, Banderite, neo-Nazi type folks in Donetsk itself, which did not happen the last time the Azov battalion folks were caught in Mariupol. So when the cauldron closes, and a cauldron, what we mean by that is when the Russian troops completely surround Avdiivka and there's no retreat, the Ukrainians will be forced into a complete surrender, or, of course, they'll die defending themselves. But again, the suggestion is that they should probably surrender and face justice finally. So again, it's probably a great victory for Russia and a huge morale boost, probably even a precursor, I would say, to a potential second mobilization, which we've been speaking about for ages, but Russia has held off. So again, what needs to precede a second mobilization? A great victory, right? In order to boost the morale of the new conscripts, the new people taking up arms. I think that's very much needed. You can't really follow mobilization after a really bad defeat because that'll kind of leave a bad taste in the air. But the Russians doing great. Meanwhile, in Zaporozhye, and naturally the death of a very notable figure, Alexander Mojayev, need to mention that because he had the really famous Cossack beard. An Orthodox Donetsk Cossack whose ancestors pre-revolution were also Cossacks, has died, unfortunately, in Zaporozhye, so memory eternal to him. The only reason I mention him was because he became somewhat of a meme in 2014, given his epic, absolutely caricaturish beard, a gigantic beard, and his Russian papacha hat, which is one of those tall Cossack hats. He looked like something out of a pogrom caricature, like just a typical Cossack type of character holding a black AK-47 with some optical attachments onto it. Like, he looked amazing, but he's finally fallen after 9 years of hard fighting for the Russians and the Orthodox troops in Donetsk, in Zaporozhye. He has died on the Zaporozhye front, so memory eternal to Alexander, but not really that many news besides the Russians surrounding Avdiivka at this point.
Yeah, I think actually there's some rumor that Russia's trying to put 20,000 troops kind of on the border with Sumy and Kharkov regions up there, and I think there's ideas that that's to distract some forces that the Ukrainians might be sending into Avdiivka, force them to spread their forces thin, and really take Avdiivka, seal that cauldron, and start to actually secure all of Donetsk Oblast. Maybe that's a goal that's being achieved. Secure all of Donetsk Oblast, provide relief to Donetsk City, so that Donetsk City can be an actual resupply hub for Russian military people, so that they can continue to push and take some of those oblasts that Scott Ritter said they might be taking soon. You know, Nikolaev, Odessa, Chernigov, Sumy, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk. You know, these are places that we think within the net, whenever that mobilization comes, or whenever the next big arrow push, perhaps February 2024, we're going to really be expecting that whenever that comes. But again, Sevastopol continues to be bombarded. We know there's MiGs flying in the south of the Black Sea, but we're really hoping that perhaps Putin, you know, if NATO forces in the west are spread thin enough, maybe we can start shooting down some of those, you know, Royal Air Force and United States NATO reconnaissance planes that are feeding, you know, Black Sea Fleet positions and, you know, direct positions towards the Ukrainian forces so they can bomb Crimea and whatnot. So I'd like to see some of those shot out of the sky as well. But, you know, there's other interesting fronts, whether it's New Heavenly Jerusalem stuff or, you know, some stuff perhaps from the new possible czar. So, you know, some great things happening all over the world.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of royals, of course, descendant of Nicholas I, Russian Orthodox Emperor who reigned in the 1820s and 30s, on his mother's side, Gabriel the Russian returns to Donetsk, his home city, where him and his wife and his daughter live and reside on one of the farms in Donetsk, and he returns back to military service after an interesting stint and a series of interviews and, you know, trips he's taken from Rostov to Moscow and Petersburg, and he's traveled all around Russia giving interviews and his opinion on the SMO, as well as provided, you know, much humanitarian aid support and fundraising for the troops on the front line. Gabriel the Russian, we spoke about him earlier. So again, a descendant of the Romanov dynasty. Not much can be said. He's a very outstanding young man. Just recently turned 27 on the 14th of October, on the feast day of the protection of the Theotokos, the intercession of the Theotokos feast day. His birthday always falls on that feast day, so pretty easy to remember. But turning 27, and he's made, naturally, on social media, he's made very active comments about the current Israeli and Palestinian conflict. He hasn't hidden his opinion before about, them boys and some of their acts in the past, especially surrounding his family and what they've done to Russia. But in this particular stance, he's directly opposed the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. So just going to read his quote. Gabriel de Roshan says, "Well, let us discuss who is a barbarian, who is a beast, and who has the most terroristic methods. They have killed, tortured, and held this land for over 60 years. Let's stop thinking emotionally. Let's start thinking rationally, managing, making decisions that require us. They require us to win and be pragmatic. Whatever one may say, it is in our favor that basically Israel shouldn't have a place in Palestine and the Middle East." So Gabriel de Roshan has openly spoken out, of course, in support of Palestinians. His comment here was followed up by photographs of the Gaza bombings, of Palestinian flags, and in fact, it's very interesting that this really powerful figurehead, I guess, for the future Russian movement, Russian monarchist movement, because he himself is a monarchist, despite not stating clearly that he's going to be a runner-up to the throne. He says, look, if the Russian people call upon him, he will take up the mantle of an Orthodox Tsar, which, we don't necessarily disagree with that, but, that still needs to be said. And just the fact that he openly supports the right side in this conflict, which in this case was the oppressed Palestinians. He doesn't have to be pro-Hamas, as he said. It's let's talk about who actually is using the terroristic methods. And in a large part, it as much as Hamas is doing terroristic acts on one end, of course, with the complete consent or lack of awareness by Mossad in order to stop it, we see what Israel is doing is 10 times worse, if not 100 times worse. And now bombing Orthodox Christians, we can't be happy about that. And Gabriel de Roshan really isn't interested in that either. And here's why this sort of opinion is important. And, notable figures in Russia at the moment, we really can't have people who are lukewarm or not attentive. We need figures like Gabriel de Roshan, like Igor Strelkov, Pavel Gubaryov, etc. These figures that they started the 2014 conflict. They're aware. Gabriel de Roshan was involved in the Donbass affair as well. Well, he was 18 years old in 2014, so almost 10 years ago now. Now he's 27, just turned 27 a week ago. And in fact, it should be considered that these people, they understand what's happening, what's going on in Ukraine, what them boys are doing to the land, what kind of plans they have. And just recently, one of the Ukrainian politicians actually openly, this really interesting politician, right? So this politician openly spoke about what we discussed on one of our AFR episodes, the Heavenly Jerusalem Project. He spoke about this on Russian television. Now, mind you, a lot of silly stuff gets said on Russian TV, but whenever this particular subject gets brought up, the fact that it could be prosecuted as potentially anti-Semitic under sections 280 and 282 of the Russian Criminal Code, gives you some sort of, it does raise a few eyebrows. Like, okay, you have to really substantiate your comment here. And this former politician, his name is Ilya Kiva. He was a former member of the Right Sector, which is the Bandera neo-Nazi organization in Ukraine. So a former Ukrainian neo-Nazi. He defected to Russia, and now he's an active Russian political commentator. So a very broad history here. But Ilya Kiva appears on Russian TV and actually says, so there's a potential that Heavenly Jerusalem will provide us with an alternative. At least will provide the Israelis with an alternative. And his direct quote is, this is Ilya Kiva on TV, he says this: "Israel will lose to the Muslim world in this war and will make its sacred resettlement. Jews will make a sacred resettlement to the place where the Tzadziks came and appointed 300, 500 years ago. Tzaddiks are like Kabbalistic priests in this Hasidic tradition, right? So essentially similar to a rabbi, you could say a senior rabbi. And dying, they left their graves as a fairway for their people, who should move to the fertile lands of Western Ukraine, in fact, to the place where they had always once lived." So what is he exactly suggesting? So he's suggesting that potentially the Israelis will be returning home to the land from which they came, so Ukraine, right? Heavenly Jerusalem, or as some say, New Khazaria. So again, it's funny that all these former Ukrainian neo-Nazis have this particular opinion, and they're not really afraid to say it outright on Russian television. And it's not even looked down upon, right? So he mentioned this again in his Telegram. So we're going to look into this question a bit more as news progress. But yeah, it's a little bit interesting, Conrad, that it's almost like our episodes almost pre-run the news. It's like we speak about a subject and then it comes up literally in a headline 2 weeks later.
No, it really is quite fascinating. And I think the fact that Kiva, is saying this, and you mentioned that in theory some of these could go against certain, World War II, post World War II, very philo-Semitic Soviet, laws. But it seems that, as long as these things aren't being used to, go against, the Russian presidency and the Russian army and everything, that these things are kind of, permitted, much more socially permitted than they would be in the United States. And ironically, on the same subject, Vyacheslav Salnikov, associate professor at Voronezh State University, he stated that the involvement of the Muslim world in the conflict with its growing power threatens the existence of the state of Israel. And where will the streams of refugees flow to? It is not excluded that they will return to their historical homeland where they lived before moving to Israel. In the post-Soviet space, this is the former sedentary line in Ukraine and Belarus, where under certain circumstances Jews from Israel and other countries may return. At least under the current president of Ukraine, this is quite possible, he said. And so it seems that whether this is among, Russian academia or, a radical right-winger who perhaps he defected to the Russian side because perhaps he was, aware of, certain issues with the control of world Jewry and decided to join the other team, realizing, where certain allegiances lie, realizing maybe I shouldn't be fighting for Vladimir Zelensky and someone of his particular persuasion. But, it's very interesting. Be sure to listen to our New Heavenly Jerusalem episode. We'll have it linked below. Again, like you said, Dimitri, it's great being vindicated, but it's also, a little bit frightening.
Yeah, that's right. And naturally, these world events, as they develop, there'll be a lot more stories about what exactly will take place in the Middle East, whether there'll be a peace agreement or whether or not there'll be a massive migration. And look, at this point, it's like the option of the Palestinians, what the Israelis are actually telling them to do is to leave, to go to Egypt, to go to Jordan. They're telling them to leave. So it's not like we're promoting the great exodus of Jews somewhere to Europe or to overseas. It's not, which is somewhat genocidal. No, the Israelis themselves, in the first instance, are telling Palestinians to leave their own land. So I mean, like, look, it's almost like the tail is wagging the cow here, in fact, or the red heifer. So yeah, it's a little bit of a weird situation. We're talking about a mass migration of peoples and potentially a mass exodus, back into Europe. Very very eschatological, I think.
Yeah, I mean, people are always worried about where are the millions of Palestinians going to go, but maybe it gets flipped on its head, and we're thinking about where do millions of, Khazarians, Israelis go. But we're going to start to wrap up here, but I think an important geostrategic, international relations point we need to make is what are the countries that, perhaps in spite of maybe knowing better and having a population that, well, maybe biased one direction is really going all in for Israel. We see India, we see the United Arab Emirates, and while unfortunately the population is very much not inclined towards Israel, the Greek government, of course, all in, on Zionism, of course, completely owned. What else would you expect from a debt slave government? But not just, their own dispositions, whether it's the UAE being the target of the most, Western, rapprochement with Israel. They've been really targeted with that. India and their Hindu power structure being anti-Islam, so supporting, Israel. And of course, Saudi Arabia, they would be part of this as well as far as what the UAE goes and the power and the, diplomacy specter. But between their rapprochement with Iran and their population just holding them so accountable, they've had to scrap their Israeli relations altogether. But this relates to the IMEC, the India, Middle East, European corridor, which ultimately is it's just a big trade corridor from shipping trade routes, possible even planned pipelines, overland roads through the Arabian desert that basically takes people from Mumbai in India through the Straits of the Persian Gulf, that are controlled by Oman and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, of course, through the deserts of Saudi Arabia to Israel at the port in Haifa, shipped out to Greece and the massive global shipping empire that are the Greek islands and the Greek shipping magnates. And this is, in many ways, you could almost call it a little bit of an antithesis to the Belt and Road Initiative. This is India trying to get in on those kinds of things. This is Israel, trying to counter, Iran, Russia, China, perhaps, in some of these regards. And this would obviously be key trade routes for the U.S., who the U.S. we know are probably really trying to keep India in check because they know that if China cuts us off from our dependence and the consumption we get from them, that we're going to need to quickly pivot to India and start getting mass-produced goods and stuff from that massive population that recently actually surpassed China. So, Dimitri, what are your thoughts on the IMEC?
Yeah, I think it's a really I guess, advantageous project for the globalists, for the Europeans, and even for Israel itself, which will be able to benefit for all this from all this trade and products essentially going through its land. Now, the only reason it's relevant to today's news is because IMEC essentially, most of these countries agreed to it in late September at the G20 summit. Now, naturally, this conflict today, the IMEC line, and I guess it cuts directly through Israel, as you said, into Haifa, and so this conflict puts essentially the entire thing on pause. And naturally, India, just by default, is already very pro-Israeli, given their anti-Islamic stance and their particular long-term conflict with Pakistan, which could probably be an episode in and of itself. But India definitely, as an opponent for China long-term, would benefit not just America but also the world. You could say the World Economic Forum, the globalists, all these powers who seek to. I mean, China has really made its stance very clear that China will stand with Russia on most issues. India also does not have a seat on the Security Council, right, of the UN. So, in fact, India is looking for any opportunity in order to increase some of its trade exports of the global, the world, essentially. So, in fact, it may even, so to speak, get into this agreement with the globalists, not even knowing what the long-term consequences could be, culturally as well as, I think socially for the Indian people. Like, this will not benefit them long term, even though it may bring some semblance of economic prosperity. Now, of course, the Saudi Arabians benefit from this as they do, and this particular alternative, like who does it bypass? As you mentioned, Iran. It doesn't involve Iran. This trade route completely ignores Iran, and it ignores another northern power. Like, it benefits Arabs. It doesn't benefit the Persians, and it certainly doesn't benefit the Turks. The Turks are completely ignored, and the fact that these trade routes go directly to Italy and Greece and the Greek islands is just the complete middle finger, unfortunately, like so to speak, to Turkey, to Erdogan, to the loyal Erdogan, who's kept his word on so many things, who's assisted NATO, the EU, who has held back all these immigrants from going into Greece, and he's done so many positive things for his European allies and colleagues, and in fact brought in Finland and Sweden into NATO, and they're going to be signatories soon. And he's done all these beneficial things for the Western powers, and they spit in his face. So again, this really powerful economic route is going to go for Israel instead. And so this may even influence the fact that Erdogan and the entire Turkish society, including, by the way, the Kurds. So the Kurds also again agree with with the Turks and Erdogan that they want to support the Palestinians. So all of Turkey is united completely, including the Kurds as well, which is a little bit funny, but given their long-term animosity amongst themselves. But Erdogan is not very happy. The Turkish elites are not happy. They're being bypassed. So again, very interesting economic development, which is at the moment on hold. And this would naturally create a second route similar to the one through the Suez Canal, and a possible alternative. Again, what this says about Egypt, who is a very loyal American Israeli partner at the moment, I'm not sure. It could just be, honestly, this could be a big gamble, as you said, Conrad, against China and against Iran. This China, Iran, Russia axis. That's all it could be. It's not even probably against Egypt or against the Suez Canal trade route. It's not even talking about maybe a destabilization in that region, but it's in fact just saying that, look, we're going to have to power up India immensely quickly and very efficiently. We're going to need to have India develop economically it'll have to compete with China long term. And that's the projection here. So the globalists, they play on multiple fronts. They're playing 6D chess. So it's just about keeping up and following the news, seeing exactly how it'll play out. And naturally, Israelis are involved. So don't be surprised if you see on social media a lot of Twitter followers with Indian names, with Indian profile pictures, with maybe even Hitler pictures supporting Israel and the Zionist cause. It may seem contradictory, but there is a backstory to it, as funny as that is. So, and despite the fact that Israel really doesn't like pagans or Hindus or anything like that, but it's a very bizarre alliance, which we'll see how far it goes.
I've never seen so many swastikas supporting the state of Israel. It's fascinating. The true IDF, the Indian Israeli Defense Forces, are really a force to be reckoned with online. I haven't seen this much activity since the infamous, Indian African American race war on the timeline those many moons ago. But, about to wrap up here. I'll give you a chance, Dimitri, to give any last words. As of now, there seems to be extreme internet cutoffs, no internet at all in northern Gaza. So this could be this could portend a big ground invasion. We're always watching. They're having massive buildups. I think the forces are just ready to go whenever they're given the order from the defense minister and Netanyahu himself. So we're watching that very closely. As far as stuff going on in the East, we've seen some pretty futuristic weapons, railguns tested on the sea in Japan. So, whenever this thing really goes off and major powers declare war, we're going to be watching closely to see what kind of directed energy railgun technology is deployed, because that's going to mark, remember World War I and World War II showed the world, industrial mechanized warfare. Eventually, we're going to show the world, digital warfare, and digital in the sense where still people are still getting, shot and blasted, and what that really means. So, we've even seen, Japan perhaps tested that railgun in response to North Korea aggressively, increasing its production and now apparently providing Russia with tank and artillery shells. So, with all of that, before I do the plugs, Dimitri, what are your last thoughts?
Yeah, just the futuristic warfare, right? It's not just about artillery and drones and mines, as we see in Ukraine, causing the majority of casualties. We're also looking at mass immigration as a weapon, Egypt openly stating that. We're seeing hypersonic missiles. We're seeing new railgun technology. Lord knows what other missile technology being developed around the world. And we're seeing Russia scrap its nuclear test ban treaty, which, again, only speaks to the fact that Russia, if this thing does escalate, will begin testing new nuclear missiles somewhere up north again, just like the US has been allegedly testing nuclear missiles in Nevada, which is a little bit like, it sounds like we're back in the Cold War, but we're in fact beyond that. We're in this at the beginning, at the end of hegemony, and at the beginning of this new world, this essentially rising World War III. So in fact, lots of new stages of warfare are emerging, not just cultural, social, but again technological as well. Very, very scary time, but again, there's always hope on the horizon, as we've spoken about. And yeah, let's pray for the Palestinian people in Gaza who, as far as we're talking about a hypothetical war or even a Cold War, which is heating up, the people in Gaza are experiencing the equivalent of Operation Barbarossa right now as they're being bombarded into oblivion, including the Christians of Palestine, the members of the St. Porphyrius Church in Gaza. We need to pray for all of those people, and may the Lord grant them mercy and just protect them from the Zionist bombs. I think that's a prayer simple as that. From the enemy, essentially, will, may the Lord give them strength. I think that's the primary message of just the week, and I think that's what all the hierarchs are praying for and fasting for, as Father Trifon and the Patriarch of Jerusalem have informed us of.
Yeah, Abbot Trifon made a call for this. We're going to have a link to the Order of St. George the Great Martyr below. They have, I think, a fund going for the Christians in Gaza, so be sure to click on that. Metropolitan Neophytos, who predicted all this in that same February 3rd talk, he actually talked about man-made earthquakes and what happened, right before that Turkish election, not long after he made those comments, man-made earthquakes. We talked about the energy weapons that might have used that, and other Turkish politicians even talked about that. So pay attention to Metropolitan Neophytos, and like you said, Order St. George the Great Martyr. Pay attention to the Antiochian Archdiocese website. Our Twitter page, we're posting the names of these people. There should be, prayers and names of people you can pray for, places you can donate and support, and, fasting and prayer directives from your local bishops on all of this. Especially, I know Archbishop Peter also put out some things about, if you're in America, writing your local representatives about opposing Ukraine's persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So we'll have a lot of this stuff linked. Be sure to check out our socials with all of that. We have all of these things on there on World War Now's Telegram. Our Telegram has exploded this week, World War Now Telly. Be sure to check it out. We've been shared by some big pages. We've gotten some scoops and everything, so be sure to check us out there. World War Now _ on Twitter. The Twitter's also doing fantastic. Follow me there on Twitter. I'm GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri on Twitter at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. That's where you get everything. Subscribe for free to get every episode directly into your inbox a day early. You get it earlier than the YouTube channel. And if you subscribe, get behind the paywall on Substack, you get access to every episode of Ether Hour, including our deep dives on controversial subjects like the New Heavenly Jerusalem, and our most recent episode where we discuss the direct link between, the history of, Jewish conflict, often called pogroms in the early 19th century, towards very even today, and how early Zionist terror was actually trained in the early, socialist, anti-czarist, revolutionaries that fought against the Tsar at the beginning of the 20th century, how this is all a direct linear connection. So listen to that recent episode. It's really good stuff. worldwarnow.substack.com. With all of that being said, follow us everywhere. Continue to pray for the Christians in Gaza and Palestine. Donate at the link below. And with all of that, thank you so much for listening, and God bless.